wind had shifted. It didn't howl, it just pressed in, a constant cold push from the north that carried the smell of ash and something else Eben Riker couldn't quite name. He stood alone in what was left of his shed. The roof was gone, timber blackened, iron hinges twisted and hanging useless from scorched beams. The ground underfoot still steamed, where the fire had sunk deep into the dry-packed dirt. One of the wagon wheels had melted into itself. The fence nearest the shed had collapsed inwards like it had lost the will to hold. It wasn't the first time Eben had seen fire tear through land like this. But this time it had come for what little he had left. He coughed into the sleeve of his coat and looked out past the edge of the smoke-smeared yard, past the broken fence and over the field gone stiff with frost. There was a stretch of open ground between him and the tree line, and nothing in that stretch ever moved, not in winter. So when he saw something there, slumped and still, his eyes narrowed and his hand went to the old rifle leaning by the porch. He walked toward it, slowly, boots crunching hard frost and scattered debris, the leather creaking with each step. The figure wasn't moving. He lowered the rifle when he got closer and saw what it was. A woman. She was lying on her side, legs drawn up like she'd dropped in exhaustion and stayed that way. Her dress was torn along the sleeves and hem, soaked through with mud, and clinging to her back in patches of ice. Her hair was matted to her face and frozen in strands across her cheek. One foot was bare. The other had a shoe, cracked and too small. Her fingers were raw, bruised, blood beneath the nails. Eben stood over her and didn't speak. She blinked up at him once, flinched at his shadow, and then her eyes rolled back. She collapsed fully into the dirt. He didn't hesitate. He leaned down, tested her pulse with 2 fingers against her neck, and when he felt it, slow but steady, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, no resistance. Her head dropped against his shoulder like she had nothing left to keep it upright. Eben Riker didn't ask questions. He carried her through the field, past the scorched shed, through the front door of his cabin, and into the bedroom that hadn't been used in years. The room still smelled faintly of the lavender satchel his wife had hung on the headboard. That satchel hadn't moved since Clara died 5 years back. Neither had the quilt. Neither had Eben's grief, if he was honest. But now this woman was lying there, her arms limp at her sides, her skin turning pale under the flickering lamplight. He set the lamp on the small table and shut the door behind him. Inside the main room, Eben worked fast. He stoked the fire higher, added the thick logs he'd been saving for deep winter. He pulled the kettle from the hook and filled it from the pump out back, carrying the water in one hand, rifle still slung over his shoulder just in case. When he returned to the room, the woman hadn't moved. He knelt beside the bed and started cutting away the wet parts of her dress with his hunting knife, stopping when her breath hitched or her eyes fluttered. He didn't speak to her. There didn't seem a point. She wasn't fully there, not yet. He cleaned the cuts on her arms and wrists. He noticed the deep yellowing bruises beneath the surface. Older injuries, some weeks old at least. Rope burns along the ankles. Scratches that looked like she'd run through barbed wire or fought her way out of somewhere rough. He had no name for her yet, no story. But her body spoke enough to make him quiet. He wrapped her in wool blankets. He let the fire warm the room before placing a bowl of broth on the side table. She didn't wake to eat it. Eben sat outside her door that night, on the floor, his back against the wall. He didn't sleep. He listened. By the time the first light broke over the treetops behind the cabin, the fire had burned low and the chill had crept back in. Eben stood in the doorway of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her. The woman hadn't stirred since he carried her in. Her breath came shallow but steady, and her hands, now clean and bandaged, lay still on top of the blanket. The skin beneath the bruises had taken on some warmth again. That gave him enough reason to believe she'd stay alive through the morning. He left the room without a sound, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The air bit through the wool like it wanted to prove a point. A light snow had started falling overnight, soft and soundless. His boot prints from the night before were still there in the frost. He followed them to the barn. Inside, his 2 horses shifted in their stalls, ears twitching. The barn smelled of wet hay and singed wood. The southern corner was still blackened from the earlier fire, but the damage hadn't reached the tack wall or feed bins. That was luck more than planning. He forked fresh hay into the stalls, checked the water barrels, and gave the brown gelding a pat on the neck before heading back. There wasn't time to dwell. He had someone under his roof now, and he hadn't invited her. But she was there, and until he knew why, it was on him to make sure she didn't bleed out or freeze to death in the room his wife used to sleep in. By mid-morning, she stirred. Eben heard it first, the soft rustle of wool against cotton, the creak of the bed frame as she shifted her weight. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, stopping just short of the bed. She was sitting up slightly now, her back against the headboard, eyes scanning the room like she couldn't place herself yet. When she saw him, her body went tense. He didn't move closer. "You're safe," he said. His voice was quiet but firm, steady in tone. She blinked. Her lips parted like she meant to speak, but no words came. She looked down at her hands, fingers twitching under the blanket. "You were outside," he added, still standing by the door. "Collapsed. Cold. Hurt." She nodded once. "Quick. Nervous. I cleaned the wounds. Nothing more." Another nod. Slower this time. Her throat moved like she swallowed hard. "You hungry?" Her eyes met his. For a second, he saw something, caution, yes, but also confusion. Then she nodded again. He didn't say anything else. Just turned, left the room, and returned 10 minutes later with a tin plate of warmed-up eggs and bread and a mug of hot water. He sat on the table by the bed and stepped back. She didn't touch it right away. Just stared down at the food like it might vanish if she blinked. "I ain't gonna ask you anything," Eben said. "Not unless you want to talk." Her shoulders eased a little at that. Still no words, though. He left the room again. This time he closed the door gently behind him and went back to the porch to split more wood. The sun had barely cleared the trees, but the light was harsh, winter light, unkind and revealing. Each time the axe came down, he let himself think about the situation. She wasn't just a drifter. Not with those bruises. Not with that look in her eyes. She'd run from someone. And she'd picked his land, his broken-down field, his yard covered in ash. Why? That question stuck with him until late afternoon, when he brought her another plate of food and found the first one empty. She still hadn't said anything. That night, he checked her wounds again. She let him, said nothing, but didn't flinch like before. He cleaned around the bandages, kept his eyes on his hands, and when he was done, she finally spoke. "My name's Marla." It came out low, hoarse. He looked up. She didn't meet his gaze. Her eyes stayed on the far wall. "Kane. Marla Kane." Eben gave a small nod. "Eben Riker." She gave the barest nod back. Then silence returned. It was after she'd fallen asleep that he sat outside her door again, this time with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. He sat there a long while. He thought of the bruises, of her bare foot in the snow, of the cuts across her wrist that looked like someone hadn't cared whether she bled. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew what kind of men made women run in the middle of winter without shoes or direction. The kind of men who wouldn't stop just because she disappeared. Inside the room, Marla Kane slept in the bed of a woman who'd died 5 winters ago. And Eben, whether he admitted it aloud or not, had already decided she wouldn't be leaving again. Not unless she chose to. That was the first real choice he'd made in years. And it didn't need words. 2 days passed before Marla said anything beyond her name. Her voice was quiet when it came, almost like she was testing whether it was still there. She'd been sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, the same blanket pulled around her shoulders even though the fire in the main room burned high. Eben was at the table by the stove, working a whetstone over his old knife when she finally spoke again. "I didn't mean to come here." He didn't look up. "Didn't figure you did. I didn't know where else to go." Still sharpening, he kept his hands steady, his tone even. "This land catches strays. Always has." She went quiet again after that, and he didn't push her. But that small exchange filled the room with something new, an acknowledgement that whatever had brought her there hadn't been just luck or coincidence. It had been desperation, and maybe instinct. Later that afternoon, she walked out of the room on her own. Eben had just stepped in from feeding the horses, hands cold and dirt still clinging to his boots. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her standing in the kitchen, barefoot, arms wrapped tight across her chest. She was staring at the pump's sink like she wasn't sure how it worked. He said nothing, just walked past her, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. I used to work in a kitchen like this, she said suddenly. That made him turn. Where? A ranch west of here, closer to Fort Banner. Eben nodded slowly. He knew the place. There were 4 large holdings past Fort Banner, all owned by men who cared more for acreage than the people who lived on it. It was the Morley spread, she added. Hire me on as cook. Said it was honest work. Eben said nothing. She pulled her arms in tighter. It was at first. Then his sons started hanging around the bunkhouse at night, asking questions that didn't need answers. She looked up. You ever seen a man take something just because no one tells him he can't? Eben didn't answer. He set the kettle on the hook above the fire and lowered himself slowly into the chair across from her. His face remained unreadable, but something behind his eyes shifted. That's why I ran, she said. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it. Every time I stayed, it told them I didn't have a choice. You did, he said. I did eventually. She looked down at her wrist, where the bruises were fading but still visible. I took a horse, one of theirs, rode until it collapsed. Then I walked. Eben leaned back, arms resting on his knees. How long? 3 days. No food the last 2. My feet split open the second night. I thought I'd make it to the river. I didn't. You made it here. She met his eyes then. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. That evening, she helped slice potatoes. Her movements were careful, like she still didn't trust her hands to hold steady. Eben cooked the stew without comment, and they ate side by side in silence. Not close, but not far either. The space between them no longer felt like a wall. After supper, she folded the linens that had been drying on the line outside. Her fingers moved slowly, smoothing each edge like it mattered. Eben stood at the window, looking toward the tree line, the rifle leaned beside him. The sky was turning gray with snow again. There's no one coming after me, Marla said from the doorway. You sure? She hesitated. No, but I don't think they'll bother. You think or you hope? I hope, she said quietly, then added, I don't know what I'd do if they did. You don't need to know yet. She nodded. A minute passed. Then 2. She turned and went back to the bedroom. Closed the door but didn't latch it. That night, Eben sat by the fire instead of at her door. Not out of carelessness, but out of something else. A small shift in trust, maybe. A sense that she wasn't just recovering now. She was staying. Before turning in, he looked once more toward the field where she'd collapsed. Snow had covered her footprints, but he remembered exactly where they were. The snow had thickened overnight, covering the path between the cabin and the barn in a clean, undisturbed sheet. Eben stepped through it just after first light, his boots leaving deliberate tracks as he crossed the yard with a lantern in one hand and a small bucket of oats in the other. The sky was still low and gray, but the wind had settled, leaving the world unervingly quiet. Inside the barn, his horses shifted at the sound of his steps. The fire-scorched corner still smelled faintly of smoke. He fed the animals, checked the walls for any fresh leaks or cracks, then spent the better part of an hour replacing broken planks from the fence that had collapsed after the fire. His hands ached from the cold, joints slower than they used to be. Still, he didn't stop. He worked because it kept his mind still, or at least quieter. When he finally returned to the cabin, Marla was sweeping the front room. She paused when he entered, straightened, and nodded once before setting the broom aside. I can handle the dishes this morning, she said, almost like she needed to justify her being there. You don't have to. I want to. Eben gave a single nod, pulled off his gloves, and moved toward the stove to warm his hands. She watched him for a moment, then stepped into the kitchen. He could hear the faint sound of water from the pump, the scrape of plates. That was how things settled for the rest of the week. Marla didn't talk much, and Eben didn't ask questions, but their movements started to overlap. She rose not long after he did. She brought in wood when the fire ran low. She boiled potatoes, patched one of the coats hanging by the door, refolded the linens without being asked. And Eben, in turn, began to make space. He cleared the second hook by the door for her shawl, built a small stool beside the hearth where she liked to sit, and left extra bread on the table without comment. One morning, near the end of that week, Marla stood beside him outside while he repaired the coop. "You always live out here alone?" she asked, her arms wrapped tight against the cold. "Not always." She waited, but he didn't add anything. "My husband," she said after a moment, "died in a fire. That was 3 years ago." Eben nodded slowly. "Sorry, I'm not," she said, and then turned her eyes back to the coop. He wasn't kind, and he wasn't patient. He didn't respond. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that sometimes silence gave people more room to say what they needed. "He was the reason I left the territory. Went east to work. Thought distance would fix things. Did it? No," she said plainly. "But I learned to work without being told what I was worth." They stood together a while longer. Eben handed her a hammer when she reached for it, and together they nailed the frame back into place. That afternoon, she found a bundle of folded fabric in a chest in the back room, a set of Clara's old dresses, neatly stored but long untouched. Eben saw her standing with one in her hands, the soft blue one with small silver buttons. "I can wear something else if this bothers you," Marla said, her voice steady. Eben looked at the dress, then at her. "She wants someone to use it." That was all he said, and it was enough. Later that night, as snow tapped softly against the windows and the fire burned low, Marla sat by the hearth mending one of Eben's old shirts. He sat across the room, oiling the barrel of his rifle. They didn't speak, but the sound of thread pulling through cloth and the slow movements of his hands formed a kind of quiet rhythm. When she finished the shirt, she folded it and placed it on the table, then turned toward him. "You don't ask much," she said. "Don't need to. You never wondered if I lied about where I came from. I figure if you were lying, you'd talk more." She almost smiled, but didn't. Instead, she nodded and stepped back toward the small room she'd claimed. But just before she passed the doorframe, she turned. "What happened to your wife?" Eben let the question sit a moment. His eyes stayed on the rifle, his hands still moving slow across the steel. "Storm caught the ridge," he said. "Lightning hit the shed. Fire spread faster than I could run." He didn't need to say the rest. The silence that followed made it clear. Marla nodded once. "I'm sorry. I'm not," he said after a long pause. "Not for remembering." She lingered in the doorway a moment longer, then went inside without another word. That night, neither of them slept early. The fire kept burning, and in separate rooms, each of them lay awake, not in fear, but in the unfamiliar quiet of feeling safe enough to rest. The next morning brought wind, dry and bitter, cutting down from the northern ridge like a warning. Eben stood by the barn doors, his coat collar turned up against the cold, watching the sky shift in layers of low gray. He knew that kind of weather. It didn't break fast, the kind that sat over the land for days, soaking into every board, every joint, every breath. Inside the barn, he tightened the latches on the feed bins and tossed extra hay into the stalls. The horses moved slow, pressing close to the walls, sensing the change like animals always did before weather turned bad. He checked the nails in the south wall again, reinforced it after the fire, but it still bothered him when the wind pushed too hard. When he stepped out, Marla was by the chicken coop with a basket. She wore Clara's old coat, now mended, and one of the knit scarves she'd found in the trunk. Her fingers were red from the cold, but steady. She didn't look up until she heard the snow crunch behind his boots. "Hen laid 2 this morning," she said. "Nothing from the others." "Too cold," Eben replied. Marla stood straight, brushing her hands off against her skirt. "You ever go into town?" "Only when I have to." She hesitated, then said, "You'll need more salt soon. Sugar's low too." "I'll go. I can go," she said quietly. "If that's all right." He studied her for a moment. "You sure you want to?" She gave a small nod. "I won't stay long. I just want to be able to stand in a room without thinking someone's coming in behind me." Eben didn't argue, but he didn't answer either. Inside the cabin, they sat across from each other at the table. He poured coffee, and she sipped it without comment. The silence was familiar now. Not heavy, just there. Then she spoke again. "Do people in town know you?" "Most keep to themselves." "Anyone ask questions if I walk in with your wagon?" Eben met her eyes. "They won't ask questions to your face." She understood what that meant. The kind of town it was. The kind of men who stared but didn't speak, and women who said plenty but never said it where it counted. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said. "I know." Still, he didn't like the thought of her going alone. Not because he thought she couldn't, but because he knew what silence from a town could turn into when no one's looking. "I'll take you," he said at last. Marla's expression didn't shift much, but something eased in her shoulders. 2 days later, with the sky still locked in gray and the cold holding firm, they loaded the wagon. Eben hitched the gelding and double-checked the reins. Marla packed a small pouch with cloth she'd hand-stitched into sacks. She took no money. Eben handed her a tin of coins wrapped in a handkerchief. They rode into town in silence, the only sound the creak of the wheels and the breath of the horse rising in small white clouds. When they reached Dry Willow Crossing, the street was quiet. One cart by the mercantile, smoke curling from the roof of the smithy. A few eyes looked up from porches but didn't linger. Inside the store, Marla moved with purpose. Picked what was needed, nothing extra. Salt, flour, coffee beans, soap. The clerk didn't say much. He looked once at Eben, once at her, then looked down again. The way folks did when they didn't want to be involved. It was on the way back to the wagon that trouble stirred. A voice called from across the road. "Riker." Eben turned slowly. A man stepped out from the saloon side. Mid-40s, unshaven, mean in the eyes. Levi Brandt, a ranch hand who used to ride with one of the bigger spreads west of Fort Banner. Trouble followed him like a shadow. "That your new housemaid?" Levi asked, looking at Marla. Eben didn't reply. "She looks familiar," Levi added. "Like one of them who worked up near Morley. Might be someone looking for her." Marla's hand tightened around the edge of the burlap sack. Eben stepped between them. "You looking for something, Brandt?" Brandt shrugged. "Just being friendly. Funny what shows up in a man's wagon these days." Eben didn't raise his voice. "You got anything else to say? Say it like a man. Or walk." Brandt didn't smile, but his tone dropped a little. "You don't want her kind. Brings questions. I'm not asking yours." They stood silent a long moment. Then Brandt turned and walked away. Back at the wagon, Marla climbed up without saying a word. Eben joined her, snapped the reins, and they rode out without looking back. Halfway home, Marla spoke, her voice low. "He knew me. I figured. He's one of them. He was there sometimes. Not often, but enough to know what they let happen." Eben didn't ask anything further. He didn't need to. Back at the cabin, Marla unpacked the goods while Eben stabled the horse. Neither mentioned Bran again that night. But when Eben went out before bed to check the doors, he added a second bar to the front latch. Not because he was afraid, because he knew how men like Brandt worked. Quiet first, loud later. And now, there was someone in the house he'd decided not to lose. 3 mornings after the trip to Dry Willow Crossing, Eben stepped out before dawn and found the fence gate swinging open in the wind. He hadn't left it that way. He'd locked it the night before. He remembered the sound of the latch, the way it caught tight in the cold. Snow had blown across the footprints, but one set remained faintly pressed into the drift along the edge of the post. They were smaller than his. Not horse tracks. Not his. Not Marla's. He stood still for a long time, looking out across the white field, the barn dark beyond it. His hand moved to the rifle propped beside the door. He didn't raise it, just held it. When Marla came up behind him, her voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Something wrong?" He didn't look at her. Someone came close. Left before light. She stepped closer, eyes following his. "Think it was him?" Eben didn't answer. He just stared down the slope toward the edge of the trees. Might have been. He shut the door behind them and pushed both bars into place. Then he checked the windows, top and bottom. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. That day passed with little said between them, but the air inside the house felt heavier. Marla stayed closer to the kitchen. Eben moved slower, more careful. Every sound from the wind or what made him glance up. He split wood with more force than usual. Stacked it too tight by the hearth. As night fell, Marla lit a second lantern for the back room. "I can keep watch tonight," she said. "You don't have to do it alone." Eben didn't respond right away. Then, without looking up, he said, "You don't need to be the one waiting anymore." She studied him. "I can't hide in the corners of your house forever." "You're not. It feels like I am." She meant it, not as complaint, but as truth. She had been moving carefully since she arrived, taking small steps forward, but never quite planting both feet. "Not really." Eben finally looked up. Then stay in the middle. What do you mean? Don't ask where to stand. Just stand. It wasn't tenderness in his voice. It was weight. The words of a man who'd lost too much to speak soft anymore. That night, after supper, Eben pulled the bench close to the front door. He sat with the rifle across his lap, listening to the wind tap against the windows. Marla brought him coffee and a blanket, then sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask if he wanted company. She just stayed. After a long stretch of silence, she spoke. I don't remember the last time I felt like I could be still. Eben didn't move. You're still now. That's what scares me. He looked over at her, the firelight moving across her face. You think it won't last? I know it won't. I've never had anything that did. She turned toward him. Why do you keep letting me stay? Eben's eyes stayed steady. Because you don't ask to leave. She swallowed hard at that, like it hit deeper than she'd expected. Then she looked away. After midnight, she finally went to sleep. Eben stayed up until the fire dropped low, and even then, he didn't move from the bench. Not until morning began to break and the sky bled into a soft gray over the ridge. He stepped outside, rifle slung, and walked the edge of the fence line. No new tracks, but someone had been there. The question that had hung in the air since Chapter 1, whether Marla had been truly followed, was now real. The threat is present, even if unseen, and Eben's quiet protection begins to shift into full awareness and preparation. Later that day, as he stood by the shed repairing the stall gate, Marla stepped outside and joined him with a small pot of boiled potatoes. I saw your hands shaking earlier, she said. Your joints. Most days. I can help. I know. That evening, she chopped wood while he watched from the porch. She moved carefully, steady, stubborn. The axe was too heavy for her frame, but she didn't ask for another. She finished what she could, then stacked it in the lean-to and returned inside with red hands and grit in her eyes. Eben didn't speak, but he left a cup of hot water and salve on the table where she'd sit. That was a rhythm now, watching and answering in action, not in words. By the time the snow came again, heavier and sharp-edged, the house felt different. It wasn't just where she stayed. It was where she returned each night. And Eben, for the first time in years, had stopped counting days as things to get through. Now, he marked them by small things. Her walking out in the snow with him, her folding a clean shirt by the fire, her silence becoming less guarded. But neither of them said the words. Not yet. The following week settled into something neither of them dared call peace, but it was close enough to make the quiet noticeable. Eben repaired the remaining fence line after a night of wind pushed it down. Marla finished sewing the last of the winter curtains, hung them in the kitchen, and started planning what she could cook with what little they had left. The ground was frozen solid, and the root cellar gave no surprises. But even small meals held weight now. Shared bowls of stew, flatbread warmed on the stove, dried apples softened in hot water. Still, both of them knew that the unease hadn't left. It had simply gone quiet. Eben kept his rifle by the door now, always loaded. He never spoke of it, never explained, but he checked the windows each evening twice. He started locking the barn too, even though no one had ever come that far before. Marla didn't ask why. She knew why. On the fifth night, after they'd seen the footprints, Eben came in from feeding the horses with a strange look on his face. Not panic, but alert. What is it? She asked. Trap near the fence was tripped, he said, pulling off his gloves. Didn't catch anything, but it was moved. Wire was bent wrong. Animal, no prints. Nothing big enough to shift it. Marla stood still, then moved toward the stove without speaking. She poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup and brought it to him. Her hands were steady. I want to ask you something, she said after a long silence. He looked up. If someone came, if it was one of them, and if they had a badge or a paper or even just enough mouth to sound convincing, what would you do? Eben's eyes held hers. He didn't blink. I wouldn't let them take you. Marla didn't answer for a moment. Her jaw tensed. Then she looked away and sat down at the table across from him. I just needed to hear that said, she murmured, even if I already knew. That night, she didn't go to her separate room. She stayed near the hearth while Eben sat in the corner chair, rifle across his knees, boots still on. The fire burned steady. Neither spoke. In the middle of the night, Eben stirred. A sound outside. He was on his feet before the chair creaked. He moved to the door, pressed a hand to the wood, listened. Nothing. Then there. A single, deliberate step on packed snow. Then stillness again. Marla was already sitting upright, wrapped in the blanket, eyes sharp but quiet. "Stay low," he whispered. He moved to the window, pulled back the edge of the curtain just enough to see. A figure stood 20 paces from a porch. Eben didn't move. He watched. The figure didn't shout, didn't raise a weapon, just stood there in the cold. Then, slowly, turned and walked back into the tree line. Eben stood at the door long after they were gone. The next morning, Marla came out to the porch and stood beside him. "I know who it was," she said. "Brant." She nodded. He never used to yell, never hit, just watched, lingered. That's how he worked. Stayed just close enough to make you wonder. Eben didn't respond. He stared into the woods where the figure had disappeared. "Why now?" she asked. "Why not weeks ago?" "Because men like him don't act until they think you've built something you'll fight for." Marla was silent for a long time. Then she said, "He's not after me. He's after what I've started to have." Eben glanced at her. "That may be, but he'll have to come through me." It wasn't a dramatic promise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't swear. He just said it like it was already decided, because for him, it was. Later that day, he began reinforcing the shed door with spare timber, nailed shut the side windows, moved the shotgun closer to the hearth. Marla made no protest. She helped him drag the heavier planks from the barn, kept the axe sharp, boiled water for cloth strips, and stored them with the oil lamps, just in case. But something had shifted. This wasn't hiding anymore. This was preparing to stay. At dusk, as the wind dropped off and the fire warmed the room, Eben sat across from Marla at the table. She reached across, took the old shirt she'd repaired for him, folded it once more, and set it neatly between them. "I never belonged anywhere," she said softly. "You do now," he said without pause. She didn't smile. She only looked at him, eyes steady. For the first time, she believed it. The snow came harder that week, blanketing the ridge line and cutting off the old trail into town. Eben kept track of the sky each morning, judging what the wind might bring, how much daylight they had left before frost turned the steps outside to ice. His body moved slower now, knees stiff, back aching when he bent too long, but he never said a word about it. He kept to his routine, hammered down loose shutters, checked the roof for leaks, cleared a narrow path from the barn to the well. Inside the cabin, Marla made broth from the last of the salted meat. She scrubbed the floorboards until her hands cracked from the cold, and she watched the windows like something might appear through them if she turned away too long. But Brant didn't come back. Not that day. Not the next. Not the one after that. That silence made things worse. Eben knew what waiting felt like. The kind of waiting that wasn't passive. The kind where you counted breaths instead of minutes and measured safety by what you didn't see. On the fourth night, they sat by the fire after supper. Eben had moved the bench closer, rifle resting against the wall beside him. Marla stitched the collar of a shirt, her needle flicking in and out of cloth in a steady rhythm. Then suddenly she stopped. "Why didn't you remarry?" she asked, her voice even. Eben didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire, the light running across the side of his face. "Clara was all I ever wanted," he said after a moment. "Didn't seem right trying to fit someone else into what we had. She died 5 years ago," Marla said gently. "I know. You never thought of starting over?" "I did," he admitted, "but not like that. Not with town women who wanted a roof more than a man." She let the silence sit. "And now?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I don't think you came here to be claimed," he said. "And I'm not the kind of man who asks for more than someone's willing to give." Marla's hands lowered slightly, the thread still caught between her fingers. "I've never had anything that was just mine," she said. "Not without a cost." "You still don't," he said. "Nothing out here belongs to anyone. Not really. But you can build what lasts. If you stay." That word hung in the air, stay. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. It was a line drawn gently in the sand. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The next morning, they found more tracks. Not fresh, but clearer now that the snow had crusted and hardened. They led from the eastern slope down toward the old trail, then vanished into the tree lane. Eben followed them halfway, Marla walking behind him in silence. He held the rifle tight, his eyes scanning every gap in the trees. They returned without speaking. That evening, as they split wood under the eaves, Marla said something unexpected. "I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder." "You won't have to," Eben replied. "I want to stop running." "Then stop." "It's not that easy," she said. "You don't just turn it off. You don't have to turn it off. You just have to stop doing it alone." Her breath caught a little, not from the cold, but from what that meant. "I was alone for a long time," she said, "even when I wasn't." He didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. They carried the wood inside in silence, but it wasn't empty. It held the weight of something unfinished, something coming into focus that neither of them wanted to speak too soon. That night, the storm rolled in heavier than expected. Thunder cracked over the ridge and the wind howled down from the hills. Around midnight, the sky flashed, and Eben sat upright from the floor near the hearth. Marla had fallen asleep in the chair, wrapped in a quilt. Another flash, closer, then a sound neither of them mistook. A sharp crack, then a glow. The barn. Eben grabbed his coat, boots barely pulled on, and shoved the rifle into his hand as he yanked open the door. "Stay inside," he said over his shoulder. But Marla was already behind him, barefoot, pulling her shawl tight around her. The barn was lit from within, orange light licking at the seams between boards. He ran first. She followed. By the time he reached the door, flames had caught the hay. Eben didn't wait. He tore the latch open, smoke pouring out thick and heavy. The horses were screaming inside. He disappeared into the haze. Marla stopped only long enough to grab the water bucket near the fence, then ran after him. Inside the barn, Eben fought blind, unhooking leads, pulling rope, slapping flanks. One horse broke through the rear stall, bolted into the snow. The other was stuck, panicked, kicking against the back wall. Marla's voice cut through the smoke. "Eben, I've got it. Get clear." She didn't move. She dumped the bucket across the stall wall, grabbed hold of the lead line, and pulled. Eben came out coughing, arms scorched, face black with soot. Marla half dragged him into the snow. His knees gave, and she knelt beside him, water steaming off his shirt. Her hands were shaking, her face streaked with ash and sweat. "You damn fool," she said through tears. "You could have died in there." "I wasn't going to let them burn," he said hoarsely. She touched his face then, wiping blood from his cheek, fingers trembling. "You're the first thing I've loved in years," he said, voice low, broken. She didn't cry. Not then. She just held his face in her hands, both of them breathing hard, snow falling thick around them, the barn behind them still glowing. The fire didn't take the house. It didn't take the horses. And it didn't take either of them. By dawn, the flames were out. Inside, by the fire, Marla held his hand as she cleaned his burns. No words passed between them for a long time. But they both knew what had changed. They hadn't survived alone. They had done it together. By morning, the barn stood black and wet under a sky that no longer threatened snow. Smoke curled from the broken beams, low and sour. The roof had partially collapsed, but the rear wall held. One horse had to be tethered under a lean-to until Eben could rebuild. The other, the mare, stood stiff and shaken in the yard, her flanks scorched but intact. Eben moved slower now, the skin on his forearms raw, fingertips blistered, knuckles cracked and bloodied. He didn't speak much that day. He didn't need to. Marla stayed close, not hovering, just present, brushing ash from the kitchen floor, pouring water over bandages, setting bread out without asking if he could eat. She cleaned the cuts on his hands with cloth soaked in boiled pine and salt. Eben winced, but never pulled away. They both knew the fire hadn't started on its own, and they both knew it wouldn't be the last attempt. Later that day, while he rested by the hearth, she brought out the sack he kept under the floorboard, one she hadn't seen until now. Inside, a folded U.S. cavalry coat, a rusted medal, 2 maps, and a ledger with a long discontinued seal on the cover. "You were in the army?" she asked, not accusing, just quietly, as if the pieces had finally started fitting together. "Scout," Eben said. 12 years. Mostly along the Western Trail routes. I left when Clara asked me to. And the fire? Wasn't my first." He looked down at the floor, voice low but steady. Clara died in one, but the one before that, out east, took 4 men under my command. We were ambushed, burned out of our camp. Nobody expected fire and snow. You think it's Brant? Eben nodded slowly. I do. And what does he want now? I don't think it's just you anymore, he said. I think it's that someone like you ended up somewhere he can't reach without being seen. Because I stayed. Because you stopped running. Marla sat beside him, unwrapping a fresh bandage. She worked carefully. His skin was raw, but her hands were gentle, deliberate. We can leave, she said after a long silence. Start somewhere new. Eben looked at her. I've got enough saved, she continued. We could take the wagon west, maybe Oregon, or south. They say Prescott's got work and open land. I don't want to leave, he said plainly. You'd stay even if it meant more fire? I'd stay even if it meant facing him. She sat back, her hands resting on her knees. The fire crackled behind them. Then we make this place ready, she said. That night, they worked side by side, reinforced the cabin shutters with extra timber, dug shallow trenches at the front of the yard in case they had to create a barrier, moved the horses to the tree line, tied beneath thick brush in case of another attack. Eben showed her how to reload the rifle. She didn't flinch when he handed it to her. You ever fired one? He asked. Once. Long time ago. Hit anything? She looked at him. Didn't need to. Eben gave a quiet nod. Let's keep it that way. They slept in shifts that night. One by the window, one by the door. Snow began again around midnight, soft and slow. But no one came. In the morning, Marla found a bundle wrapped in canvas by the edge of the barn ruins. It wasn't there the night before. Inside, a broken horse bridle, a tin mug with a bullet hole, and a charred scrap of fabric. Message sent. Bran was baiting them, trying to unsettle, to force fear back in her bones. Marla picked up the mug, held it in her hand. Eben came out, saw it, and stopped. He wants you to know he's not finished, he said. He's wrong, Marla replied. They buried the bundle in the back pasture. Quiet. No words. That afternoon, Eben brought in lumber from a neighbor's supply, shed 2 miles down the road. He didn't explain how he'd asked or when he'd gone. But by sundown, the first beam of a new barn wall was rising. Marla cooked stew that night and set 2 bowls on the table. They ate facing one another in silence. After, she stood beside him at the sink, washing dishes while he dried them. When they finished, she placed the cloth down and didn't step back. You meant what you said, didn't you? She asked. Eben looked at her. About what? About me being the first thing you've loved in years. I did. Her breath caught just a little. Even after all this. Especially after all this. That night, when they settled by the fire, she didn't bring the quilt to the chair. She sat beside him on the bench, her head leaning against his shoulder. No promises were spoken. No vows made. But the fire burned clean, and no one stood outside.